Romanians, the Serbs, the Croats, the Bosnians, the Macedonians, the Albanians, and the Bulgarians. We will not be discussing the Greeks. They have a very distinct history from the other Balkans peoples, and the Hungarians as well. So where are the Balkans? It's in the southeast of Europe, in those countries I was just describing. You have kind of Hungary, Ukraine to the north. You have Italy to the west, Turkey to the east, and Greece to the south. Most of the peoples in the Balkans today, they speak Slavic languages. The Bulgarians, the Serbs, the Croats, the Slovenes, the Bosnians, the Macedonians as well, they all speak Slavic languages. And the Albanians, they speak Albanian, and the Romanians, they speak Romanian, which is a Latin language. Now, what all of these languages have in common is they're Indo-European languages. That is, they're related to German, to English, to Hindi, Bengali, Farsi, Kurdish, and Russian. And that goes back thousands and thousands of years. So where did these peoples come from? How did they mix? How did they form? That's what we'll be discussing today. So we should go all the way back to the very beginning, the last ice age. So way, way back, before 12,000 BC, quite a bit of the world was actually frozen over. There wasn't really agriculture outside of a couple ephemeral civilizations that had collapsed, and most of the world was inhabited by hunter-gatherers. The Balkans were no exceptions to this, and they were inhabited by kind of two clades of hunter-gatherers. And out of those two clades, there were several subraces, which are somewhat difficult to split apart. The two big clades are the eastern hunter-gatherers, who, of course, are in the east, more in Ukraine, and to a lesser extent, kind of bleeding into southern Romania, what's called, Wallachia, where Vlad Dracula was from. And, you have the western hunter-gatherers, who are, of course, from Western Europe, and, they're all very southern, though, in the last ice age. They're very much restricted to kind of the coastal territories that are, warm and sunny and have that Mediterranean climate today. The Western hunter-gatherers were split into at least two different races, one of which was in the Balkans, or really in former Yugoslavia, and the other one which, was more spread out through the rest of Europe. The one in former Yugoslavia, mostly around the very mountainous area, is noticeably taller than the other Western hunter-gatherers. As the Paleolithic, that's kind of the technology level that people had in the last ice age, turned into the Mesolithic, that's the technology people had from, maybe around 9,000 to, 4,000 BC, the people that were still hunter-gatherers, that is. They went and they actually had a pretty tremendous decrease in their health. A lot of those people became shorter, they became less healthy, they had more issues with diseases, and that seems to indicate that their populations had been increasing. So there were probably a lot more people, even as hunter-gatherers in 6500 BC than there were in 1200 BC, which makes sense given the climate was warming, there was more life wandering around, so there's more stuff they could hunt. And, there are signs of stratification in some areas like modern Czechia. That's a bit north of the Balkans, but I imagine the Balkans were pretty similar. Now, there is, one part of the Balkans, former Yugoslavia, particularly the highlands, that did not experience that kind of issue. 170 centimeters in height for women. And that's at a time when a lot of the other hunter-gatherers had fallen down in height to, maybe 150 to 160 centimeters. So these, that kind of stereotype of the very tall people from the Dinaric Alps, that's been a thing for a very, very long time. Even though, as it turns out, these hunter-gatherers have, only comprised a very, very small amount of the ancestry of the modern-day peoples of the Balkans. So you have these Western and Eastern hunter-gatherers. who are kind of roaming around. They presumably lived very, very violent lives. Kind of comparative archaeology shows that hunter-gatherer societies are extremely violent. Perhaps, at the low end, a sixth of men, and at the high end, two-fifths of men would be killed, in violent actions. So definitely not peaceful people by any means. But they were definitely, a lot of them were very in good health, especially the ones in the Dinaric Alps, at least relative to the farmers that would come and largely replace them. So these hunter-gatherers, they'd been in Europe for all those thousands and thousands of years. And then towards the end of the 7th millennium, really the 63rd century BC, there's all these cataclysms just all over the world. You see them in, the Caspian Sea, the Black Sea. There's stuff going on in the Middle East, stuff in like the Lake Baikal area in Siberia. There's stuff going on in America's Pacific Northwest and modern-day Oregon. Europe's no exception. There were massive floods that presumably killed quite a few people in the Danube River basin. You also have the kind of land bridge that connected the British islands to continental Europe was actually drowned, in 6200 BC as well, and kind of 3 giant mega tsunamis. The tsunamis were actually so bad that the Scottish Highlands, which are nowhere near the coast and they're quite high, as you can tell from their name, actually have seashells that are in the layers from that era. So it's very, very bad climactic time, probably due to kind of a shift in global warming. Now, presumably, the Western and Eastern hunter-gatherers, were devastated by these ecological changes, in large part because they had to live near the water. They needed something to drink, and the areas that had the densest populations of them were near rivers. The Danube, which flows through the Balkans, was almost certainly no exception. So you have all of these catastrophes, and then as a result, a people from Anatolia, that's the modern-day Asiatic part of Turkey, they go and they actually cross the Aegean Sea, and they start to settle in Greece and in the Balkans. And this is also right around 6200 BC. So what it looks like is this kind of massive ecological collapse, and all this flooding and catastrophes, weakened the Western and Eastern hunter-gatherers enough that these people called the Anatolian farmers could go and settle in the Balkans. And so for the first few hundred years, they were actually kind of stuck in the southern part, in Greece and Bulgaria, Macedonia. And, they came in contact with kind of surviving bands of the Western hunter-gatherers, and they actually did incorporate a few of them into their, tribes. So the Anatolian farmers, that's when they turn from being the Anatolian farmers into the early European farmers, or EEFs, as they're usually called in academic literature. The EEFs in the beginning were about 95% Anatolian farmer and 5% Western hunter-gatherer in ancestry. They would grow things like millet, and they kind of loved to live around low S soils, so they had kind of a limited ecology that they could go and settle. So as a result, they would go and they take over any area with low S soil. They'd really, again, very focused on, kind of rivers, that areas, but they did leave a lot of land, abandoned. They couldn't settle it. They were very poor at fishing. They weren't very good at hunting. They really kind of stuck around. They grew their grains on the low S soils, and they also herded their pigs. So the Western hunter-gatherers and the Eastern hunter-gatherers, they did survive in a lot of peripheral areas, forests, mountains, those kind of things. The introduction of pigs was probably devastating to the Western hunter-gatherers. We have, again, kind of comparative anthropology from what happened with the Amerindians in the Americas after De Soto's expedition introduced pigs to the American Southeast. Pigs are actually, just horrible, disgusting animals. I mean, they taste very good, and they're, they eat anything, so they're very, very good source of protein for humans, but they do carry a lot of diseases. And my guess is another one of the reasons the Western hunter-gatherers were kind of devastated and the EEFs, the early European farmers, replaced them in a lot of Europe, in the 1200-year period from 6200 to 5000 BC, is because you have these wild pigs that they're bringing over from the Middle East. They're carrying all these diseases. They rampage around Europe. They eat shrubbery and just spread everywhere. And as the Western hunter-gatherers encounter them, eat them, especially if they're undercooking them, they catch these diseases, and it weakens their tribes even more. So the whole Balkans is kind of settled by 5500 BC. It's not enough for the EEFs. They spread all over Europe. They reach Portugal by 5200 BC. But there's some regions like the Baltic, kind of like modern-day Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, northern Poland, the kind of coastal part of the North Sea, as well as the British Isles, remained completely out of the range of the EEFs. So the EEFs, they go, and as they kind of reach right around 4900, 4800, 4700 BC, they've kind of settled all the lands that they can settle. And they're always a very violent people, possibly even more violent than the Western hunter-gatherers. Some of the sites of the EEFs that we have in Germany are some of the most violent that have ever been observed, with outright majorities of the populations having signs of violence, ritual sacrifice, cannibalism, that sort of thing. It's difficult to tell if that sort of thing was true in the Balkans as well, but we can presume they were definitely not a very nice society. So right around kind of 4800 BC, you have a lot of these EEF societies that start to decay and decline all over Europe. Now, whatever happened after that, they do recover for a few hundred years, up until about 4400 BC. And what happens in 4400 BC is really in the century previous, there had been discoveries of copper in, kind of modern-day Romania and Hungary. And this copper actually changed things quite tremendously. When people just have kind of stone tools, when stone arrowheads, that kind of thing, it's very difficult to cut down trees and change your ecology. Once you have things like copper axes, you can cut down more trees, you can change your ecology, it becomes easier to plow soil, just all sorts of things. Deadlier weapons, more effective agricultural tools. And so in 4400 BC, there's actually an even more major collapse of this kind of EEF society. And you have what's called the hunter-gatherer resurgence. Now, the hunter-gatherer resurgence did not affect everywhere in Europe equally. There's some areas like Iberia, modern-day Spain and Portugal, where about 75 to 80% of all the Y chromosomes afterwards are from the Western hunter-gatherers, even though only about 15 to 20% of the ancestry of peoples of Iberia at that point was from the Western hunter-gatherers. Something similar happened in Hungary as well as Romania. You have these hunter-gatherers that go and they rise up from their mountain and river and coastal homes, and they go and they take over these EEF societies. I don't think it's a coincidence that the spread of metalworking was associated with this. I think it kind of disrupted a lot of the political structure, the trade routes, all that other stuff, and it made it so these hunter-gatherers, who were presumably healthier than the EEFs, were able to overcome them. One thing that is been determined is that the EEFs were actually evolving to be shorter. A very heavily grain-based diet that they tended to kind of push up against their Malthusian limits for their ecology. They would just keep on having more and more kids until they'd filled up, everything they could. Whereas the hunter-gatherers killed enough of each other, never had kind of a state to, make sure that they hit that population. So the Western hunter-gatherers would usually have enough meat, enough protein, enough food to make sure that they were big and tall, so they do not shrink. So they're definitely taller, stronger, fitter, healthier than the EEFs. And they go and they topple them, in the eastern part of the Balkans in that 4400 BC collapse. Now, In the Western Balkans, it's actually different. There is no collapse. So, kind of in modern day Croatia, Serbia, Bosnia, the Western hunter gatherers do not overthrow the EEFs. It's the one part of Europe where the EEFs actually um, survive, and they actually stay, about that original 95% Anatolian farmer, 5% Western hunter gatherer, and ancestry. Whether or not this is due to them killing off all the WHGs, the Western hunter-gatherers, when they moved in, whether or not they, some of them might have been hunter-gatherers and they took over the Western hunter-gatherer territory, it's hard to say, but we do know for sure from the genetics that they were not overrun by the Western hunter-gatherers like everyone else in Europe was. Greece was kind of different as well. They got overrun by another new group from Anatolia, but that's a bit out of the topic of this conversation. So in the Balkans, we start to see, we have all these cultures kind of at the end of the 5th millennium, the late 4000s, and they go, and one of the things they do, particularly in Bulgaria and Romania, is they build things called tells, Tell, and it's actually an Arabic word, I believe, and what it is just a settlement that's existed for so many hundreds or even thousands of years that the settlement just keeps on being built on top of other settlements, so it ends up forming a giant hill, and everything underneath that hill is just other layers of older settlements. And so these are actually very easy to see. You can go, Bulgaria, Romania, all sorts of places, and you can see these tells. A lot of times they were, built overseeing kind of like the confluences of rivers, strategic areas, that kind of thing. One thing that was really common in history, and presumably prehistory as well, was that they would go and they would build their settlements on places where they could control the river trade. So when people are kind of sailing their canoes around, they could send someone out to intercept them, take percentage of their goods, and that's the origin of kind of tolls. It starts off as piracy. They realize that rather than being capricious and just taking everything they can make a bigger profit if they just go and allow for people to pass and just pay a small part of their goods. Now, all these tells, they go, and a lot of them are actually destroyed and abandoned for hundreds of years, starting in the early 4th millennium BC. And you have what's called the Suchevo culture, which had signs from the, of origins from the steppe, kind of like Ukraine, southern Russia, that area, being settled kind of in the mouth of the Danube, so kind of eastern, right where Romania and Bulgaria, their coastline with the Black Sea, that whole area, they go and, you have these invaders from the steppe who go and overrun it and presumably a lot of people. What had happened was on the steppe, people had domesticated the horse, and horse domestication had actually spread to Central Europe, within the next 500 years. By 3500 BC, a lot of people in Central Europe did have the horse as well. And what was happening was you would have these steppe raiders. They would just go and they'd ride their horses, and they would dismount, and they would get off. They'd destroy a village, destroy a tell, and then just ride off. And the poor EEFs at the time, this is before they had the horses, they couldn't do anything. They could run, but they couldn't outrace the horses. So, you have this kind of fall of the civilization, in kind of the eastern part of the Balkans. And the western part of the Balkans was really spared of this. Presumably the Carpathian Mountains and similar stuff shielded them. You have kind of further up in northern Romania, Moldova, even into western Ukraine, the Cucuteni-Tropalian culture. I know that's kind of outside of the Balkans, but they went and they actually had quite a bit of western hunter-gatherer ancestry on top of their EEF ancestry. And so they actually went, and their civilization kind of regressed at the same time, early in the 4th millennium. All of those kind of Eastern Balkans societies had actually been very wealthy. There's large tombs, there's gold, copper, they had metallurgists, very, very complicated and advanced peoples for the time. These were all Copper Age societies. And, they started withdrawing in fewer but more fortified settlements. So these kind of steppe raiders were very much a big deal and threatened a lot of the people there. So who were these steppe people? These steppe people were the Indo-Europeans, the people whose language we still speak today. These particular Indo-Europeans were most likely the direct ancestors of the Hittites and speakers of the Proto-Hittite language. The Hittite language actually split off from the other Indo-European languages first, several hundred years before the other ones. So the split from Hittite from Proto-Indo-European actually lines up very well with the Sucevo culture, and these kind of horse raiders that devastated the Eastern Balkans in the early 4th millennium. And these guys are actually kind of important because once we get to the Western Balkans, several hundred years later, we're looking at the fall of, some of these societies. And, they go, and it looks like specifically these kind of proto or para, groups that were related to, but not necessarily of the, Proto-Hittites, ended up being the first ones to invade the Western Balkans, modern-day Yugoslavia. So some of the finds with one of the cultures, the Vucedol, I'm sure I'm mispronouncing it, my apologies to, the Croats and the Serbs on here. They go, and their ancestry is interesting because it only has a mix of the steppe people, the Indo-Europeans, as well as the local EEF farmers. They don't have any of that kind of hunter-gatherer ancestry that you'd expect to be characteristic of groups like the Cucuteni Trypalians and the other groups of the Eastern Balkans. So what it looks like is that some of these kind of early, proto or para-Hittites had actually penetrated into the Western Balkans by around 3000 BC. They had controlled the region around, they controlled kind of the Pannonian Plain in Hungary, as well as kind of the coastal plain in Bulgaria and Romania at the time. And it looks like they did go and invade kind of Slavonia, Croatia, Hungary, parts of Austria, Bosnia, northern Serbia. So it's kind of a unique group. They had been split off from the other Indo-Europeans by hundreds of years by that point. So kind of the first Indo-European group that invaded kind of the northern part of former Yugoslavia was actually Proto-Hittite rather than Proto-Slavic or Proto-Illyrian or Proto-Albanian or anything. Now at some point, in the next 1,000 years, they were actually replaced by new invaders. The new invaders were actually quite distinctive in ancestry from the Vucedol people. The Vucedol people, again, they were a mix of kind of the EEFs and the, Indo-Europeans. They didn't have that Western hunter-gatherer mix. The next group that came and settled in Slavonia and Dalmatia, those are both parts of Croatia, did have a lot of the hunter-gatherer ancestry. And when the geneticists actually looked at their ancestry, they determined specifically that the new mix came not from, the predecessors, the Vucedol people, but the, we mentioned the Globular Amphora people earlier. The Globular Amphora people, they were an EEF group in kind of northern Hungary, Slovakia, eastern Germany, Poland, and they had an unusually large amount of WHG ancestry. They were, maybe like 60% Anatolian farmer and 40% Western hunter-gatherer in ancestry. So they have a very unique ancestral profile, for EEF groups, and they really stand out. And, the EEFs, they fought all sorts of terrible wars with each other. The Globular Amphoras, I think a lot of them are actually quite linguistically distinctive from each other. But that's a, kind of complicated topic. Originally, the EEFs may have spoken Proto-Berber. It's very much an open question, though. But by the time the Indo-Europeans invaded in the 3rd millennium BC, they most likely spoke a wide variety of different languages, not just because of linguistic diversification in the previous 3,200 years, but also because the Western hunter-gatherers had taken over a lot of these CEF societies and most likely imposed their language on top of them. I think it was something probably similar to what happened in the American Southwest, where you have groups, like the what's a good example? Like the Hopi, for instance, they speak an Uto-Aztecan language, even though they're very clearly descendants of the local Puebloan peoples. The Uto-Aztecans were just a bunch of kind of desert savages. I'm putting it in more simple terms. Whereas the Puebloan peoples were actually quite advanced Neolithic society. What it looks like is you have these, desert tribesmen. They overrun the civilized people, impose their language, even though most of their ancestry is still from, the settled people who had the much larger population. So I think it's similar with the EEFs. We have a possibly Proto or Berber-speaking group, that ends up being conquered by these WHG groups, imposes their language. They would have been visibly distinctive from each other as well, both due to the diversity within the WHG groups, long-term kind of reproductive isolation from each other. So they do go and start to have a different look, and then just different amounts of WHG ancestry. So, the group that is in Croatia 1,000 years later, in the early second millennium BC, they don't have the ancestry from those kind of Copper Age EEF groups. They have specifically the EEF ancestry from the Globular Amphora people, on top of the ancestry of their Indo-European people. So what it looks like happened was the Indo-Europeans who were living in Hungary or Poland, who had conquered these Globular Amphora people, when they started to migrate to the southwest, most likely in the late third millennium during the second wave, or really third wave of Indo-European invasions, they came in contact with other Indo-Europeans and destroyed them, or at the very least marginalized them, before taking over the Balkans. And again, Greece is very, very distinctive from all of this. Now, this is where the Albanians actually originate. The kind of Paleo-Balkans, or Proto-Albanian peoples, they go and they're most likely the kind of linguistic descendants of that specific branch of Indo-European invaders that did arrive in the Balkans in kind of the late third millennium BC. Proto-Albanian splits from kind of Proto-Indo-European in the late third millennium BC, so the dates actually line up quite well. So hence, that's where the that's when the first Albanians arrived, probably around 2200 BC. So the Balkans almost certainly did not remain the same for the next 1500 years. Those are kind of the only samples we have, the ones from the early third millennium, late third millennium, or not the late third millennium, the early third millennium BC and the early second millennium BC is when we have the Bronze Age samples for them. The Bronze Age had started around 3200 BC, by the way. So undoubtedly, there were a lot of other changes. I'm sure the Bronze Age collapse almost certainly had an effect. It was certainly a major catastrophe all over the world, and I'm sure it affected the Balkans as well. And I will do more reading and let you guys know once I find out more about it. It's just there's no DNA samples from that time, so it's really hard to say. Regardless, though, kind of the genetic profile of a lot of the Balkans outside of Greece again was largely formed, at least for the pre-Roman period, by that second Indo-European invasion around 2200 BC. So, things, as far as ancestry-wise, it doesn't change too much until the Romans arrive. So you have all these Paleo-Balkans peoples, the Dacians, the Illyrians, all these other groups, and most likely, their languages are related to Albanian. Some Y chromosomal haplogroups that are associated with, some EEF survivors in, Serbia and a bit further south in the Balkans. They were incorporated, into this kind of gene pool of the Balkans peoples, and are found as far north as kind of central Serbia. So that's, most likely the Illyrians were indeed speakers of Proto-Albanian. So the Romans come along, they conquer everything, they enslave a lot of people, they, and they create their Pax Romana. And they built, these fortifications along the borders of their empire to fortify them against their barbarian neighbors. Some of these neighbors were Iranian-speaking peoples, like the Scythians or Sarmatians. You also have the, some of the Celtic peoples up in Scotland and Ireland, and you have the Berber peoples in North Africa. And then you have the German people in Germany, as well as, Hungary at various points. And so as a result, they build all of these, kind of fortified cities, and they bring their legionaries from all over the world to settle there. A lot of the Roman writers, they kind of comment, even in like the 2nd century AD, when the, Republic is kind of starting to have problems, and you have like the Gracchi brothers and stuff, and they actually go and they complain that you go into the countryside and you don't see any Romans. You just see all these, Germans, Illyrians, Egyptians, people from the Levant, Anatolians, and they were right, actually. And the problem actually, the shift, I should say, it's not really a problem, continues as the empire, as the Republic turns into the empire. The cities in Rome, in Britain, and in the Balkans as well definitely become a lot more diverse. So at the burial sites, from one of the places they have right on the Danube frontier, only about half the people there are, kind of the native Balkans peoples. And this is in the 2nd century AD, so right around the time of the Emperor Trajan. So the height of the empire, after they go and they conquer Dacia, destroy the Azagis and all those other groups. So only about like half the burials they found there are kind of native Balkans peoples. And a lot of the groups are actually from kind of like Anatolia, as well as Syria and Lebanon specifically. So back then, Syria and Turkey, that's Anatolia, they went and they actually had considerably larger populations than Northern Europe or even Western Europe. Egypt, for instance, was the wealthiest, most populated province in the empire, except other than maybe Italy. I'm not sure. I have to look back at my Roman statistics. But anyhow, so you had, most of the legionaries were recruited from the east. You had, all these Easterners coming over, whether it's migrants, slaves, whatever, that go and settle everywhere in the urban parts of the empire. In the Balkans, it looks like they were actually part of the upper class. Out of the 7 best kind of burial sites, 3 of which are pairs, only one of them is not of Middle Eastern origin. So you have, presumably the upper class was largely Levantine or Anatolian in origin within the 2nd century AD. And this is kind of interesting because in the 3rd century AD, you actually have the Illyrian emperors. I believe there were 6 of them. Diocletian is the one that comes to mind. And they were actually from Illyria. And it looks like a lot of these guys, their ancestry presumably included a lot of Levantine elements. You very much had these wealthy and powerful people from the east who were settling in the Roman Empire, acting, becoming very powerful, very wealthy within it. And you had the, kind of native peoples, of the Balkans marginalized at this time. Greece, again, very unique circumstances. This only kind of applies to the north. So what happens in the 3rd century is you have these kind of Illyrian emperors. They go and they reach their peak. You have all these, Diocletian, for instance, he reunites the empire. So they reach their peak in power, but their kind of demographic base starts to deplete. You have diseases. Cities are always population sinks. You just have a lot of people in close quarters. Housing's expensive, so family formation's delayed. And kind of the social structure isn't necessarily as conductive to relationships as it is in rural areas. And then there's just no need for all the extra farm labor that kids are so useful for in kind of peasant societies. So, there's not as much need for kids either. And that's why you have kind of a lot of the Roman emperors, they go and, they don't necessarily have kids. They go and they adopt their heir instead, because a lot of them would presumably die from disease or that sort of thing. And I believe they had a method of birth control as well based off this plant from modern-day Libya. So anyhow, the groups that were kind of in the countryside were actually more fertile and kind of kept up their population share even despite this mass immigration from the Levant and Anatolia. So in the 3rd century, of the crisis of the 3rd century, there's population decline, you have barbarian invasions, there's political chaos. I think that's when the year of the 4 emperors is. You have 4 emperors in Rome. So all sorts of people die, and it's no exception in the Balkans. The burials from the 3rd century, or actually they're from the early 4th century, I apologize, are actually pretty different demographically. You do have the one guy from the Levant, but you also start to see a lot more of the kind of original Balkans peoples who had been there for, the previous 2,500 years. Going back, one notable thing about the burials from the 2nd century AD in the Balkans was there was a man from kind of northern Sudan, specifically the kingdom of Meroe, probably mispronouncing that. So there was a guy with black skin who was living in modern day Serbia way back in the 2nd century AD, and there were also 2 Germans there too. And the Meroese guy, I don't know what the proper demonym for them is. He was a legionary, and he had like a legionary eagle, at his burial site. So going forward in time, the sites from the 4th century, you start to see people with specifically Sarmatian ancestry, as well as German ancestry within the Balkans. There had been people, the Lombards wouldn't come down for another 200 years, or another 100 years, sorry. But the Sarmatians had migrated. They'd been largely defeated, but it looks like some of them were incorporated into the local population. So you do see this kind of shift of the Balkans populations that started to really shift towards the north, with the Germans, and towards the east with the Iranian peoples who used to rule the steppe prior to the arrival of the Turks and the Slavs. On the steppe itself in Ukraine at the time, really western Ukraine, I should say, west of the Dnieper River, it was controlled by the Chernyakov culture, which was actually the Goths. There's a few DNA samples of the Goths, all from their ruling class, of course, since those were the ones with the nice burials that have been preserved. And, they're very clearly a, Germanic element that was ruling Ukraine at the time. The masses of the people, it's hard to say who they were. Presumably there were quite a few Slavs and Iranians amongst them, but of course, more research is needed. So, and of course the Goths, they go and they migrate and they, invade the Roman Empire in the next 200 years. So, those are kind of the last samples in the 4th century. We don't have any more until the 10th century. And there had actually been some very, very important events that had happened in the, interspacing period, often known as the Dark Ages. So you have, all the way from the east, you have the Xiongnu, who are going and they're fighting their terrible war with China, and they eventually lose, and this is a couple hundred years before. But they had brought like a lot of the steppe tribes into their orbit, and some of these steppe tribes, they go flinging out all the way to the west. One of these tribes was quite possibly the famous Huns that go and threaten the Roman Empire. So the Huns come, they kind of, they take a bunch of, and all the steppe tribes, they were, very, very diverse. You'd have, like the Hungarians a couple hundred years later, for instance, were like an Uralic tribe, but they had Iranians, Slavs, Caucasians, and Turks coming along with them. And the Onagers, which I believe were a Turkic group, that's where Hungarians get their name from in English, even though Hungarians call themselves the Magyars, which was the Uralic-speaking group. So all these kind of steppe hordes, they were very diverse. They had a lot of different tribes underneath them. And the Huns were no exception. They got all these, Germanic guys underneath them, and they go and they invade the Roman Empire, and they push quite a few, Germans into the empire as well. And, that kind of sets a chain of events that leads to the fall of the Roman Empire. You have the Vandals that sack Rome, you have the Goths that set up their Gothic kingdom, the Vandals are in North Africa, all that stuff. So the urban population is actually devastated. The, settlement that had the guy from Mero and the two Germans and, all the people from the Levant and Anatolia in the 2nd century, it's actually completely destroyed, in the Dark Ages. The barbarians overrun it and kill everyone. So those people, as a result, they did not have, very many descendants. Now, another group that comes through is the Avars. The Avars, who we know now from DNA testing, are specifically a Mongol people, or possibly related to or most likely related to the Rouran people of the Eastern Steppe, who, menaced the Chinese, and they, or a branch of them, ranged across the steppe all the way to Europe, where they actually made it as far to, raid the suburbs of Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul. The Avars actually brought a lot of Slavic people, the ancestors, people similar to today's Ukrainians and Russians, with them. The Slavs at the time were kind of a primitive group. They didn't have, the they had metalworking, they had a language, but they're definitely more primitive, like in agricultural techniques, metallurgy, all that other stuff, than kind of the Latin peoples and the Greek peoples of the Western and Eastern empires, respectively. This was actually an advantage. The Roman Empire, it had economies of scale. You have there's something like millions of known amphoras, which are basically containers they would use, ceramic containers they would use to transport liquids or other goods across the sea. You had cities like Rome that were reliant on kind of a grain import. Athens was reliant on grain import as well. It just could not grow enough food for itself. And those actually proved to be huge disadvantages once the sea trade and political order and transportation networks started to break down. All those people, even if they weren't killed by rampaging barbarians, they would just starve to death or die from disease from malnutrition. Whereas the Slavic people, they were more primitives. They had their small farms, their simple tools. They didn't really need trade as much, and they could thrive even in the worst of times, which they did. And as a result of this, the Slavs actually go and they, the Avars go and they fight all their wars. A lot of their men get killed off. I believe the Franks finally destroy them in the end under Charlemagne's grandfather, great-grandfather, I can't remember. So, the Avars were largely destroyed and dissipated, although, they were in Hungary at that point. Although a handful of Avars actually do survive, and they leave a genetic trace in some of the islands off the coast of Croatia. They have a very distinctive Y chromosome that's most common, that's pretty much only found in groups in eastern Siberia as well as Mongolia. And we know now that they are the direct male line descendants of the Avars. Their overall contribution to the ancestry of those Croatian islanders is very, very small. And it's only because of their very unique Y chromosomes that we can tell that they are indeed the ancestor or descendants of the Avars. Overall, the kind of German, Sarmatian, and Slavic invasions of the Balkans did have a huge effect on the peoples of the Balkans. About half of the ancestors of modern-day Serbs and Croats and Slovenes and Bosnians do come from these kind of German, Sarmatian, and Slavic invaders who, invaded between 200 and 700 AD. It's also interesting, the Albanians, about 25% of their ancestors came through in that same period. So it looks like there were some groups. The Albanians, it looks like, were kind of a rural population. I'm not as familiar with their history as I should be, but they were, kind of a rural population that, survived the fall. And they thrived, like many others, after the fall of the Roman Empire. And that's kind of a pattern we see in a lot of areas. The Basques in Spain, they go and they massively expand with the fall of Rome. You have the old Gallic populations, the Bretons, who go and they take over Brittany in northwestern France after the fall of Rome. You have the Berbers who go and they take over a lot of territories in North Africa, which had been previously Latin-speaking. You have the Welsh who go and take over much of Britain, before the Anglo-Saxons overrun it. And the Albanians are part of that trend where the marginalized rural populations actually go and they take over after the urban populations that were considerably more diverse and loyal to the empire died off. So the Albanians, at various points in their history, they would have incorporated some of these German or Slavic invaders, which is why about a quarter of their ancestry comes from those Dark Age migrants. For the Greeks, it looks like perhaps a third of their ancestry comes from the migrants, although it's hard to say since their history is very unique and we don't have any classical age, like Pericles or Alexander, as times DNA samples for the Greeks. And then I mentioned for the Greeks too, there was a lot of change before, from before to after Alexander, since Alexander was really big amongst, promoting intermarriage amongst his many subjects. For the Romanians, it's a little bit more complicated. The DNA paper on the Balkans that came out a week and a half ago, they go, and the best match for the, modern day Romanians is not the, kind of Slavic people who have been isolated, in northern Russia, but specifically the Mordvins, who are an Uralic-speaking people of the, kind of mid-Volga. The Mordvins, I believe, if memory serves, are about 2/3 Indo-European and, maybe a third Uralic in ancestry, or probably a bit less, since the Udmurts are higher than them. So maybe 80% Indo-European, 20% Uralic in ancestry. I'd have to run the numbers. So it's the Mordvins that are actually the best source for, modeling about half the Romanian ancestry as being from these Dark Age invaders, not the Slavs. And this is kind of interesting since a lot of Romania was actually ruled by people called the Pechenegs, who were Turkic people for a long time. And the Turkic people, even today in places like Kazan and Tatarstan, they noticeably have a lot of ancestry from the Uralic peoples. Not necessarily, even far more actually than they do of kind of the original Turkic peoples of the Altai Mountains and Mongolia. So what it looks like is, for the Romanians, it is true over half their ancestry does come from Dark Age invaders, but it also does, include that extra, kind of Asiatic, Uralic, Turkic, maybe even Mongol element, in a small fraction. And then, basically the genetics of the Balkans has remained the same for the last 1100 years. There's been some change, but it's really has not been that dramatic. The Middle Ages was definitely a return to civilization. Even things like the Black Death didn't really involve kind of large-scale population replacement. I think it was different in other areas that were drier and had, less resilient agricultural populations, like Anatolia, for instance. Asiatic Turkey does look like, perhaps a fifth of their ancestors showed up in the Middle Ages, who became the Turks, of course. Areas like Iran, I think, have seen a resurgence in the amount of Caucasian as well as Turkic ancestry. But in Europe, that does not really appear to be the case. So thank you all very much for taking the time to listen into this. I'm going to open it up for questions, and I'll do the best I can to answer them.